I got the live stream up. I think I'm just going to start letting people in. We have about a minute, if you guys are good with that. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to take another couple minute or two to let people log on. Thank you for joining us.
All of those here already are now in the green room with Bill and Geneva and me.
Good to see you, David. Good to see you, Larry, too.
Hello, hello. Yeah, good to see you.
Hello.
I'll sit down, Irma. I'll go back. Yeah.
Okay, well, we are live on Facebook and YouTube, and welcome everyone who's in the room with us now. I think maybe I'll just get started doing some of the introductions. My name is Geneva Blackmer, and I'm the program director for the Interfaith Center. We are a safe and welcoming interfaith space located at the Miami University campus in Oxford, Ohio. And our mission is to invite people of diverse religious, spiritual, and secular traditions to participate in one another's practices in order to cultivate appreciative understanding and to build friendships and relationships, as well as to unify them around common moral, social, and ethical concerns in order to build a more just and equitable society for all people. We're really excited to welcome back both Bill Tammeus and Vern Barnet here with us today. Vern is actually going to be facilitating the conversation with Bill, and he is the Minister Emeritus of the Center for Religious Experience and Study in Kansas City. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Vern, and maybe if you want to give a little bit of information about CRESS as a co-sponsor of this event, and then we can get into the conversation. Thank you so much to everyone for being here.
Thank you, Geneva. Let me just turn directly to Bill. I first introduced Bill Tammeus some 40 years ago. I had read an important article he had written for the Kansas City Star about interfaith understanding from his perspective as a Christian. I wanted my Rotary Club to hear him amplify that message. I had never met Bill, so I filled out the introduction with a bio sketch. I should also say at that time, Bill was writing a humor column for the paper. After I introduced Bill, he said, "Thank you, Vern. Of all the introductions I have ever received, yours is certainly the most recent." All these years later, there would be much, much more to say about Bill's distinguished career, his awards, his leadership positions, his many articles in many journals, his books, and his blog, Faith Matters. But I must mention that tomorrow evening at 6:30, Bill moderates a panel with Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, and Jew as part of the 7 days observances. Now, I'm a short fellow, and Bill is tall. So literally, and in my case, metaphorically, I look up to Bill. I hope in the course of this conversation, you will learn about how Bill himself looked up to his tall nephew. Bill, in effect, you began writing this book on 9/11, with an 866-word editorial for the Star, which is putting out a special edition on that horrific day. Before I ask specific questions and then invite the audience to ask their questions, please take some time to tell us why you wrote this book, what it is about, and why it took you nearly 20 years to publish it. Bill?
Thanks, Vern. And by the way, happy National Columnist Day. Did you know this is National Columnist Day? It commemorates the day on which Ernie Pyle met his death in World War II. And we've made it National Columnist Day. So you can take me to dinner later if you'd like. It's really an honor to be here with you, Vern, and with everyone else who has joined us today. I want to begin by telling you that I'm coming to you from my home in Kansas City, Missouri, and acknowledging that my home is located on land that the Osage and the Kaw Native American tribes consider tribal ancestral land. As Vern indicated, I do want to tell you a bit about my new book and then respond to some questions that Vern may have, and then questions that you and the audience may have. The book, as you know, is called Love, Loss, and Endurance, a 9/11 story of resilience and hope in an age of anxiety. And let me start by describing the murder of my nephew and how I learned about it the morning of 9/11 in 2001. On that day, I was still an editorial page columnist for the Kansas City Star. I usually would arrive at the office shortly after 7 a.m. each day, and I had a 13-inch little TV on my desk that often was on but without any sound on. Before long that morning, I noticed on that screen something unusual was going on. So I flipped over to CNN to see what else I could learn. Well, when the shape of what was happening was clearer to us, editors at the Star decided to publish the first extra edition of the Star that since I had started work there in September of 1970. And they asked me to write the lead commentary piece for that edition. So just before I started writing, I forwarded my calls to our editorial page secretary, Trudy. Unless it's my wife, I told her, please just take messages from me until I finish this. Voicemail at the Star was in the future. Well, I was about 2/3 of the way through the column when Trudy slipped into my cubicle and said almost in a whisper, your wife needs to talk to you. So Marcia got on the phone and said, have you read your sister's email? Well, I hadn't. Please read it, she said, and was gone. I found a note from my sister, Barbara Fife, with this subject line, very bad news. It simply said that from what she and her husband, Jim, could tell from their home in North Carolina, their son, my nephew, Carlton Douglas By Fife, who lived in the Boston suburb of Brookline, was a passenger on the first plane, American Flight 11, to crash into the World Trade Center. This disastrous possibility had not yet been confirmed, but everything pointed to it being true, as it turned out to be. My heart fractured into a million serrated pieces. Carlton and I, after all, had developed an especially close relationship. When he died, he was 31 years old, married, the father of a 19-month-old boy. The Sunday before he left on that Tuesday to fly to California for a business meeting, he was a bond analyst with John Hancock. His wife, Haven, had told him that she was pregnant again. That baby, Parker, was born in May of 2002. The question for us today and for everyone is why did Carlton die? Well, he died because 19 hijackers had bought into the wildly bogus ideas that Osama bin Laden and others had taught them, which included the delusion that God wanted them to murder people in the United States for a series of alleged sins that our country had committed. Bin Laden and his followers claimed to be Muslims, but their curdled theology had twisted Islam beyond recognition in much the same way that the Ku Klux Klan and today's white Christian nationalists bend Christianity into an unrecognizable mess. And that too is what I write about in this new book. Through a series of short interludes, as well as one longer chapter on the theological roots of extremism, I point to case after case of magical thinking that has led to violence, from the Holocaust to the murders of Black people at Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina, to the murders of the son and father of my friend Mindy Corcoran and the wife of my friend Jim Lomano by a neo-Nazi here in the Kansas City area. I, of course, had no idea that when we set January 19th as a publication date on this book, that it would be less than 2 weeks after Trump-inspired extremists would engage in insurrection at our nation's capital. I frankly don't see much difference between the Capitol Hill rioters and the 9/11 hijackers. Both groups bought into lies, whether political or theological, that wound up costing people their lives. In my book's last chapter, I try to suggest various approaches that you and I can adopt to try to stand against extremism. And I hope readers will spend some time thinking about those approaches and what might work for them. I would like to say that I'm profoundly optimistic that if we use these and other ideas to unplug extremism, the world will turn into a peaceful place in just a few weeks. But I have read history and I know better. And yet I think we must be inspired by and guided by how Martin Luther King Jr. and others kept bearing witness to the truth, even when they knew it might cost them their lives, as of course it did his. At the end of W.H. Auden's famous poem, September 1, 1939, he acknowledges that he is beleaguered by, quote, negation and despair. And yet he asks that he may be strong enough to, quote, show an affirming flame. Well, that too is my prayer for all of us as we confront this darkness. This new book, as Vern, you indicated, took me in a sense almost 20 years to write, which is to say that I've been saving emails and letters and notes and blogs and columns on this subject since 9/11 happened, not sure what I'd eventually do with all those files, but in the end, I decided I was obligated to tell this story, in part because I'm one of the few professional journalists whose family was directly affected by 9/11. I know of only one other, Mike Casey, and Mike worked at the Star with me at the time. One of Mike's cousins died that day in the Pentagon. Not everyone in my extended family wanted me to write this book. Carlton's parents, his widow, and one of his sisters gave me either permission or encouragement or both, but his other sister didn't want it written, partly because she didn't want to deal with the media again, and partly because she believed that I would simply profit off her brother's death. So that was one more complication that the terrorists threw at our family. Well, that's a bit of background about how the book came about and what it tries to do. And with that, I will defer to Vern again for his questions and comments, and for some later comments from or questions from the rest of you.
Thanks, Bill. I'd like folks who haven't read the book to have some sense of the remarkable character that was your nephew, Carlton. In one place, you quote Carlton's cousin Amanda's story about playing Monopoly with him. Would you read that passage and the follow-up to that in your book, and anything else you want to say? And then later, I want to talk about the larger issues, but I think people will be fascinated by the tremendous loss that you felt and the loss to the world. Please.
Thank you, Vern. Yeah, this is the book, by the way, and I want to share with you that story that comes late in the book, and it starts this way. On the 10th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks in 2011, Barb and Jim, my sister and her husband, Carlton's parents, sent out a note to their extended family asking members to share, quote, your cutest or any memory of Carlton. So again, we were drawing on reminiscence, on those flashes of minutes or even seconds that fight their way to the top of our mental storage units and compete for attention as a way to keep alive something about someone who isn't alive anymore. It's a distillation process, important, yes, but also shadowy, incomplete, even perhaps at times misleading. And yet on that 10th anniversary, that's what Carlton's parents bid us do, and we were all in. One of the more revealing memories of who Carlton was at his core came, as Vern indicated, from his cousin Amanda, daughter of my sister Mary, and her husband Gary. And she wrote this. One time we were all at the Woodstock House. The Woodstock House is in Woodstock, Illinois. It's the house in which I grew up and where my parents still lived at the time that Amanda's writing about. We were all at the Woodstock House for a holiday, and we decided it would be a good idea to play Monopoly. I think I was probably about 8, Amanda says, and Carlton was 12. The other players were Erin, Carlton's sister, and Kate and Leeson, my 2 daughters. At least an hour, maybe more into the game, I was losing badly, Mandy says. In what was to be my first ever blatant attempt at cheating, I stole a couple of hotels from Erin's property and hid them. She didn't see me do it, but Carlton sure did. When Erin finally noticed part of her empire was missing, Uncle Jim, who was her partner, asked who took them and where they were. Silence. When the line of questioning came my way, I full out blamed it on Carlton. I remember I actually said I saw him take the hotels, even though I knew full well that he had spotted me taking the hotels. Uncle Jim immediately took him upstairs for a loud talk, and I could hear Carlton very upset. I remember sitting on Grandpa's green chair, riddled with guilt, yet I was clearly too deep into the lie to come clean, at least in an 8-year-old's mind. After a good amount of time passed, Carlton appeared in the living room with very red eyes. He looked right at us and clear as day said, I am sorry for cheating. He then went back upstairs and went to bed. Amanda then writes this, he never threw me under the bus. And for a 12-year-old boy, I find that amazingly protective and brave. He took my punishment, and I'm pretty sure he never held a grudge because he acted normal the next day to me, which I remember as strange because I was so ashamed I could barely look at him. Anyway, as we got older and fantastically sarcastic, I always asked Carlton if he wanted to play Monopoly. And he always said, with you, shit, no. And by the way, I think I never came clean to Jim about the fact that it was me cheating. I'm in for it now, she wrote. Well, it turned out that Mandy was not in for it because Jim replied in a note, holy crap, I have not a single memory of that incident. What the hell was I, the enforcer or something? Did I break his kneecaps too? To which Mandy replied, glad you didn't remember. I've been sweating this one out for almost 30 years. Well, that young kid with a protective moral center grew into a profoundly moral adult with a marvelous sense of humor that's captured in the memory that my daughter Leeson shared in response to that year's request for memories. Leeson wrote this, I was picking Carlton up from the airport. I don't recall why, and he'd been on a job interview recently. It must have been right after college or something. I asked him how it went, and he said he thought it had gone well. He said this, I know I left an impression. I wasn't wearing any pants. Well, that's probably a good place to stop that story, Vern.
Thanks, Bill. I have to say, one of the surprising motifs of your book is the continuing discovery or potential discovery. And I'm kind of uh, a little shaken to even say this. Discovery of parts of Carlton's remains and how they rekindled the fireball of 9/11. Would you talk about that and about grief, a theme throughout the book? I mean, there's the burial that happened years after 9/11. You talk about how grief is not bound by the calendar, how grief reshapes people. The question is, do you ever come out on the other side? Is there such a thing as closure?
Yeah.
Bill, the idea of particles of his body being discovered or potentially discovered years after 9/11, the turmoil that put your family through.
Well, let me say that it took quite a long time before anything of Carlton was discovered. And what was first discovered was a piece of thigh bone about 7 inches long. After that, there were a couple of small discoveries of a few grains of sand, essentially, about that much that was offered. But when we had our first, there were 3 memorial services for Carlton, one in Boston, one in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and one later after the remains were found. So when the remains were finally found, it took a long time to get them transferred from New York to North Carolina. And Barbara and Jim and Haven, Carlton's widow, had to decide, do you want this bone, or do you want us to bury it at ground zero? What do you want us to do with it? So they had to make that painful decision. And they decided they wanted Carlton buried near his North Carolina home. And he was in 2005, as I recall. But every time there was some message from New York about, well, we're not quite done finding stuff, and we want you to know where we are. It was another slam at Barb and Jim. The bone was finally buried, as I say, in a small wooden box that Jim made and polished to a beautiful finish. But for people who are 9/11 families, we recognize that it's not just an anniversary of a death that happens once a year. The anniversary of my mother's death is next month. It's May 24th, and nobody here knew that. And May 24th is not a national commemorative day, but 9/11 is. And so no 9/11 family gets through 9/11 without going back to the original pain of what happened. I will say that my sister Barbara handled this with enormous grace and with her traditional sense of humor. I wrote a humor column for 27 years, but Barb's really the funny one in this family. So when the package arrived with Carlton in it, and when I say package, he was sent in a full body bag, because that way the airlines respect what's going on as opposed to mailing a small box. But when it arrived, Barbara had him in a box in the house, and that evening or shortly after that, there was a North Carolina, Illinois basketball game for the national championship. And she set Carlton's, Carlton was a University of North Carolina graduate, and my parents were both University of Illinois graduates. And so she put Carlton's box on a chair in the living room and put his North Carolina hat on it. And he got to watch the game with her that night. And she mentioned the next day that she had forgotten she did that, and she was cleaning and she bumped and said, "Oh, sorry, Carlton, I forgot you were here." And so she would share these moments with us. And that helped us in our own grief. I don't know whether I've fully responded to everything you mentioned, Vern, but that's how Barbara handled that.
Bill, speaking of Barbara, you quote an extraordinary, generous utterance when Barb is thinking about the mothers of the hijackers. Can you pull that out of the book and read that to us?
Yeah, I don't know that I can put my hands right on it, but I can tell you what it is. We had a memorial service for Carlton in October of 2001 at my sister's church in North Carolina. And several of us were asked to speak. Barb asked me to say something about Carlton's childhood, partly because he would often come to Kansas City in the summer. He would come spend some time with me, my wife, and my girls. And I really got to be close to Carlton in that way. But at this memorial service, Barbara also spoke. And at the end of her remarks, she said this, and it caught me like that. She said, "And to the mothers of the 19 hijackers, I want you to know that I understand that you lost your sons too. And if you loved them the way I loved Carlton, I want you to know that I feel that pain for you as well." Well, where that came from, I have no idea exactly, except that's who Barbara is. But I was really moved almost to tears at that, and how she found that generosity at the time when she was in her deepest pain. I'll never know.
Bill, let's do a little theology, and then after that, we'll take questions from the guests. Throughout the book, you confront evil and its effects on your family and on others. And you recall so many other instances of tragedy, and we might think of Indianapolis this past few days.
Indianapolis, Minneapolis, Chicago. I mean, it's blowing
up. Goes on and on. In one place in the book, you even use the technical word theodicy to identify the problem of evil in a world governed by divine grace, at least as you as a Presbyterian conceive of the world. In a postlude to the main body of your work, you confront theological doctrine of the total depravity of humankind. And several times you note that decent, ordinary people like you and me are capable of doing great evil.
Yep.
You wrestle with what seems to be a pattern of horrors mentioned over and over again, and offer, as you said earlier this hour, not optimism, but a hope of doing good. And you remind us in the preceding chapter that you've given us 8 ways of doing good. Now, how does a joyous person you knew as Carlton illumine that theology and the opportunity to do good?
Well, as you know, of course, the old theodicy question is, why is there suffering and evil in a world if God is good and all powerful and wants the best for us? Where does this stuff come from? And there is no final exhaustive answer to that question. There are efforts at answers, but in the end, we don't have a complete answer that is satisfactory to everyone. And we should acknowledge that. That's part of what life's mystery is about. That said, and also acknowledging such a doctrine as the total depravity of humankind, which is a doctrine that in some ways undergirds the Presbyterian approach to theology. John Calvin didn't get everything right, for sure. And I think the emphasis on that total depravity is on the wrong place. But nonetheless, it does remind us that each one of us is capable of evil. And as someone who is half German and half Swedish, but half German, that half of me has to acknowledge that in World War II, almost the entire German nation fell victim to that evil and was complicit in what happened. And there have been a lot of attempts to explain why that was the case and how that happened. All I can say in the end is that I have every single day, and each of you has every single day, an opportunity to choose either our better angels or our worst angels, and to make a choice almost hour by hour, whether to do something generative and productive and joyful, or whether to commit harm to someone, including to ourselves. And being human, I will make the wrong choice from time to time, but I'm aware, I hope, that I'm making that choice and will then repent of it and try to make reparations for it or restitution. But it's something all of us face, and every religious tradition has a way of acknowledging our capability of doing evil and has processes for responding to that, of forgiveness, of repentance, and so on. And if we remember that no evil we do has to be permanent or unforgiven, then I think we can move forward. Now, the evil that the hijackers did, in a sense, is permanent. Carlton's never coming back, nor will any of the 3,000 other people almost who died that day. But we can work to create better relations between Christianity and Islam. We can encourage the people within Islam. It's their fight, but we can encourage those who are trying to have Islam not degenerate into the kind of terrorists and terrorism that we saw on 9/11. Just as we Christians can encourage other Christians not to degenerate into the kind of slavery defending, biblical inerrancy kind of Christianity that causes so much trouble. That was a long answer to that short question, Vern. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Bill. We're going to see what questions the viewers might have. I just might mention that one of the things Bill did after 9/11 in connection with some other journalists was fly to several Muslim countries and study Islam as it is actually practiced in several places around the world. So if you have questions about Islam, feel free to direct them at Bill. who would like to ask a question? And Geneva, I'll depend on you now to select people and ask them to unmute.
Let me just interrupt to say that in the chat, I have put not only the Amazon link to my book, if you don't have the book yet and want it, I've also put there my email address. If you want a signed copy, email me and we'll figure out how to do that. Sorry, Geneva, go ahead.
Okay, there's actually a question in the chat already. How do you go through this type of trauma and still rely on your faith?
I'm pretty sure I would not be able to get through this kind of trial without my faith. What that means for me is that I try to take an eternal view of things, which is to say that I could simply have collapsed in grief and in effect hated the world from 9/11 onward. But, you know, I have read history and I recognize that all kinds of evil has happened over the centuries to a lot of different people. And we have models of people who have helped us through those times. And so I look toward those models and I look toward the faith that I have that in the end, the will of God cannot be thwarted, and the will of God is for all of us to be joyful people, to be in a full and generative relationship with God. And so you move on and you try to be part of the solution going forward instead of adding to the problems by simply falling into chaos and into hopelessness. I think hopelessness is a way of telling God that God doesn't matter, frankly.
Well, Bill, in a sense, one contribution from 9/11 is your book, and hopefully it will help people know how to move forward. That last chapter, particularly where you, or next to last chapter, where you outline 8 different ways of dealing with the kinds of threats that seem to be all too frequent misunderstandings of faith. Geneva, did you want people to put questions in the chat, or can they voice them?
Oh, they can voice them. I believe, Patrick, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Bill, and thank you, everyone else. I'm a retired professor of theology and philosophy, and so I really appreciate, Bill, that you shared the story of your sister Barbara at that memorial service when she acknowledged the pain and suffering of the mothers of the hijackers. That was one of the most powerful parts of today's presentation. I did a lot of my academic research and writing on post-apartheid South Africa, and I remember at one of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings, there was a mother of a victim, someone who had been killed, who confronted the mother of the young man who was responsible for his death. And the woman walked up and embraced the other mother. And I think that there is a language that only mothers speak to other mothers. There's a mother-to-mother language. Men do not speak that language. And I would suggest that other women who are not mothers, they kind of get it, but it's not the same. There is something about mother-to-mother language that is so powerful and so beautiful. So thank you. It's more a comment than a question, but thank you for sharing that part of the story of how gracious and generous your sister Barbara was.
Well, you're welcome. Yeah, she's Barbara is a work of art, as are my two other sisters, actually, and we are literally scattered coast to coast. My oldest sister is in Berkeley. She's a musician. She's a Juilliard pipe organ graduate. My youngest sister is in the Chicago area, and she spent her life as either a teacher or in the audiovisual teaching aids area. And my sister Barbara and Jim now live on Cape Cod. So literally we are coast to coast. And so we have to Zoom every other month or so just to talk to each other, particularly in this awful COVID time. So
Yeah,
thank
nice.
you for your comment, Patrick.
Thank you.
Do you have other questions? Let me see.
Larry.
Larry has.
I'd like to follow up on I guess one that Vern started. I'm not sure, Bill, we kind of got there. I've not had a chance to look at the book, so I don't know if at the back you have any discussion questions. But my question would be is if you were invited to a group who had read it and you had a chance to pose some questions, what questions, what would you hope that people would pick up on from the book, and what kinds of questions would you suggest to get them into the discussion?
Thank you, Larry. Couple of thoughts along that line. One is a rabbi friend who read this got back to me as soon as he finished, and he said, I'm going to use this book in grief counseling. He said, I think it would be really helpful to some families who have gone through a severe loss. So I might begin in a group to have people share their own deep grief stories. In fact, one of the 8 suggestions that Vern mentioned is to talk with somebody who has experienced deep grief. Put yourselves in their shoes. Try to see the world through their lenses and through their brokenness. I think also one of the things I would ask them to do would be to share what they find most beautiful about their own tradition, religious tradition, if they have one, and what they find most beautiful in a tradition other than their own. And I would ask that because I think it's really helpful to be religiously literate, to be engaged in interfaith dialogue and conversation and action, so that we are not guided by fear, which comes out of ignorance. I was blessed as a child to live for 2 years of my boyhood in India. My dad was part of the University of Illinois agriculture team. And as a boy, thus, I got to meet and know and play with Muslim children, Hindu children, Sikh children, Jain children, other Christian children, and came to recognize as an 11-year-old, 12-year-old, these are kids just like me. And although they have a different culture in some ways and different religious traditions, I could fairly, as an 11-year-old, it's with what an 11-year-old could understand, I could understand that these are common humanity, if you will. And so it's that experience that I hope people, after reading this book, will go and find ways to be engaged in interfaith culture and interfaith development and the very kind of work that Geneva and the Interfaith Center at Miami do. That's a really important work, and we have to make it available out in the world where it's currently dismissed as unimportant or even as sacrilegious. There are some branches of Christianity in which people say we need to just stick together and everyone else is a lost sinner going to hell, and so we shouldn't talk to them. well, that's not my approach, and it's not, I think, the right approach.
It's helpful. I guess I'm understanding that the good part of the book is about grief. I also had heard that you dealing in some depth with violence, both the violence in a certain segment within Islam, the Al Qaeda type group, but also that I heard that thought that you might have touched on violence in perhaps in our own society. Is that so? Is there?
Well, I certainly write about the violence that 9/11 brought to us, but in the interludes, I raise up examples of violence, whether it's the Oklahoma City bombing or the Holocaust or the Mother Emanuel Church shootings, those kinds of things, as a way of saying, this is what happens when you don't allow doubt to guide you into reasonable discussions about things. In fact, I see this book as a natural follow-up to my previous book, which is called The Value of Doubt. And in that book, I argue that unless you are part of a faith community that allows you to ask the hard questions, that allows you to say in public, I'm having trouble with what the church teaches about this. Help me understand that. If those conversations are cut off, you will never end up with the kind of faith that will sustain you in good times and in bad. You need to be able to share with each other your doubts, your concerns, and to recognize that we all go through that. And doubt can actually be a path toward a stronger faith. So in this book, what I try to do is to show examples of what happens when people are not allowed to doubt, or when they refuse to be open about their hard questions about faith. When they lock in the answers before they've even heard the questions, that's when we're in trouble. And that's what these hijackers did.
Thank you.
Geneva, do you have another question? I've got lots more.
There is another question in the chat. Valerie, did you want to ask a question, or would you like me to read it? Okay. I guess I'll go ahead and read it then. Do you see that cause and effect plays a role in the return of evil and evil doers, as people becoming silent, as your niece became silent about the cheating and your nephew became silent about holding her wrongdoing?
I'm going to go to the chat and read that because I'm not sure I followed. Do you see the cause and effect? I think what I would say is that as someone who has avoided as much conflict as I can avoid in my life, I don't like conflict. And as someone who would be called a conflict avoider, I have learned that that's often not a very healthy way to live. I don't mean that we need to seek out conflict or stir up conflict, but if we are silent about evil that we see, and frankly, Carlton was silent about Amanda stealing the hotels, and Amanda was silent about her own complicity and her own theft, and it led to a bad result, frankly. And so silence can, as much as the monastic tradition values silence, and there are wonderful good uses of silence, sometimes silence is the enemy. And, we cannot be silent without being complicit if we are silent about things that need to be called out. So I'm not sure, Valerie, what else to say about that question, but unless we are willing to raise our hand and say, wait a minute, that's not how this should go, then some of the problems in the world are our fault.
Yes, I agree. That's why I asked that question. Silence is a good thing when it's time for silence. But if we don't speak up about what we see, and you say you truly believe in the way that you perceive your higher being, the universal cause and effect of things, then that's why it continues to manifest, because we're silent about it.
Yeah. And you don't have to be a screamer to be not silent. You don't have to be in your face about it. I think of Stanley Hauerwas, who teaches at Duke Divinity School. He's probably retired by now, but he's emeritus at any rate. He had at one point, he told me, on his office wall, on his office door, a sign that just said, "A modest proposal. Christians should stop killing other Christians." Simple way of being a pacifist, if you will, and Stanley would call himself a pacifist, but he wasn't out, screaming at people. There was even a bit of humor to that, or statement. And so that's an approach we can use, as well as being in the streets, raising our voices.
Geneva, is there another question? If not, I've got another one I'd like to get in.
Does anyone else have their hand up?
I don't want to let Bill loose yet on I very much appreciate, Bill, what you wrote about doubt. I thought that was one of the best theological pieces that you've done. You do a lot of descriptive stuff, but that was really a little speculation, but well done. But I'm wondering if some of the problems that religion caused isn't just about doubt. Just what you said a minute ago is kind of shocking. Christians should stop killing other Christians. It seems to me that one of the things, looking at history, it's kind of hard when we're all very in favor of religion, but religion seems to cause as many problems sometimes as well. I won't put in the comparison. Religion does cause problems as well as solve problems. And I just wonder if you took any reflections about how, in a sense, the dynamism of religion can go wrong.
Yeah, I was looking at my bookshelf back here, my slimming bookshelf, because my wife and I are selling this house and moving to an apartment. So what would have been a full bookshelf has a lot of empty space in it at the moment. But there's a new book that's somewhere on the shelf. It's called Dangerous Religious Ideas. And it's by a rabbi named Rachel Mikva. And in it, she says all religious ideas have the potential of being dangerous. And I agree with her, almost agree with her. I think the idea that God is love, I have trouble understanding how that might be a dangerous idea. But nonetheless, there are a lot of religious ideas that get twisted, that get turned, that get misshapen. And Rabbi Rachel Mikva raises them in a really interesting way. But you're right, Larry. Religion has certainly been the source of a lot of the world's trauma, and yet I think it has also been the source of a great deal of hope and a great deal of improvement, of caring, love, all the things that religion at its best stands for. And despite 50, 75 years ago, there was a widespread prediction that religion, especially in this country, would simply slowly disappear from the world. No, not going to happen, didn't happen, won't happen. And we better learn to have religion that is healthy instead of unhealthy.
Thank you.
Vern, do you want to hop in with your question since we have about 5?
I'll ask a question. There's not a lot of time left. And I want to let people know that David Nelson is going to have Bill Tammeus as a guest. I think, is it September, David? So that's another opportunity to throw questions at him. Bill, there's not much time left, but I do want to ask, I was so intrigued by the different kinds of rituals that you mentioned in your book, including silly songs at weddings. In your experience, why and when is a ritual to be employed and cherished, even in the face of grief? I mean, we just saw quite an elaborate ritual in England this yesterday. Tell us a little bit about ritual.
Yeah, I have an Episcopal priest friend who has written a book about ritual in which she says that we should be making up our own rituals as we go through life. Rituals, for instance, when we leave this house, I think maybe we'll have a house blessing here to turn this house over to the next person, the next couple and their little boy. Ritual helps to cement memories. It helps to draw the best out of what we're doing. It commemorates important stuff. There was a time in my life when I thought that nearly all ritual was just empty nonsense. I am way far from that position today. I think there is not enough ritual. And some of the ritual that's out there is fairly empty and rote and doesn't have the spontaneity that it needs. But ritual like funerals, ritual like wakes, those sorts of things are really important for us because they mark our hearts, they mark our memories, and they give us a place to go back to say, wait a minute, I have moved from where I was then in a bad way. I need to go back and find where I was when we did that ritual and recapture that. And that gives us that opportunity.
Say about the silly songs at weddings, and
Yeah.
how that was really a question after Carlton died.
Right. In my family, one of our rituals is that whenever any child or grandchild or niece or nephew gets married, my 3 sisters and I gather together along with whoever else wants to join us, and we make up a song to an already known tune, but with different words. And so it's funny, it's supposed to be funny, it's sometimes not funny when it should be funny, but and sometimes it goes on too long. But when Carlton's widow, Haven, was to remarry Dan, we said to Haven, "Can we do our silly songs?" And she said, "Absolutely, please do. It wouldn't be a family wedding without that." Well, my youngest daughter wasn't sure that she was happy with that. And I wrote her a note about that that's in the book saying, no, here's why we do these things. And we ended up doing the song Danny Boy because Haven's new husband's name was Dan. And the first verse was kind of silly, but then the second verse said, "The Fife boys," that is Carlton's sons, "are calling you and they want you to be their father." And so it was a way of saying, welcome to the family, and here's how we do these things in our family.
Bill, thanks again for the privilege of interviewing you about this important book. Your remarkable career showing through it. And thanks, Geneva, for the arrangements that made this possible. And thanks to all of you for joining us in this conversation.
Thank you, Vern. I just want to say thanks for your thoughtful questions, and to Geneva for putting this together, and remind folks that in the chat is a link to the Amazon page for this book, and my email. If you want to email me questions, feel free. So I'm open to that. Thanks.
Thank you both so much for your time, and thank you to everyone who joined us. I encourage you to purchase the book. I also shared it on our social media for those watching via live stream. So any final comments, closing thoughts before we wrap up?
I'm glad you have this source and this channel to do this. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Bill. I encourage all of you to check out some of the other Interfaith Center's programming. We have virtual offerings every single week. So I hope to see all of you again. And thank you so much to Vern and Bill for making this possible. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Take care.